of the day, all a historian is doing is reading historical texts and maybe trying to put them to memory and then trying to create a narrative based on what they've read. Because at the end of the day, there are lots of holes when you read history. There's lots of gaps, so you have to fill them in. So you're kind of constructing a fictional story to fill in the gaps for the non-fictional parts that you know. And so when a historian says, oh, this is what I think happened, what they're really saying is, we really don't know what happened, but based on the bits that we do know, this is the narrative I've come up with. If you make history go back to the advent of writing, then history is roughly 5,100 years old now, and at the same time that makes civilization 5,100 years old. Right, if you couple the two together. So history and civilization are co-defined. Having said that, I, as a political scientist, don't like that. So I love history, I do history. When I was teaching for the University of Maryland, University College, I was in their history department. I consider myself to be at least somewhat of a historian. So I'm not saying this to bash on history, I just think it's really arbitrary. Because as a political scientist, one of the questions I ask is, why did writing even come into being? And it looks like the reason writing came into being was that there was a state, and in this case, the state in Sumer, but also there was a state in Egypt, and these two states had a problem, and that was they had a certain amount of cattle, they had a certain amount of grain, they had a certain amount of fruit, they had wine, they had beer, and they needed horses, sheep, whatever they had. They didn't have horses. Delete horses, but sheep, right? Whatever they had, horses came later. And they needed to actually categorize and keep track of what they had. They needed to be able to take the resources and pool them. They needed to be able to distribute their resources. To do that, they needed some way of writing down what they had. To do that, they needed numbers and they needed letters, right? Or characters. So in Sumer and in Egypt, a character system formed. The problem with the character system is right away you get into this trouble of, what if we get into a new concept and then we have a word, but we don't have a character for it? So the Egyptians also began doing phonetic letters. So there's this kind of misconception that the first phonetic alphabet ever was the Phoenician alphabet, hence phonetic, Phoenician. But really, actually, it was the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that were the first phonetic alphabet. It's just that at the same time, they also used characters. So they did both. In any case, it means government came before writing, right? Because government made writing happen out of necessity. So then my next question is, well, when did government come into being? We think now that it was somewhere around 6,500 years ago, or 4,500 BC, in Egypt. Egypt did it first, we think. And then Mesopotamia did it shortly afterwards. So Mesopotamia beat Egypt to writing, but Egypt beat Mesopotamia to government. The two kind of did things in tandem. One would do one, and then the other one would catch up shortly afterwards. The reason that the government came into being, again, was probably out of necessity. In the case of Egypt, it was probably tied to the flood cycle. So Egypt doesn't get much rain, annual rain. They have instead these annual floods. What happens is it snows in Central Africa. It snows in Equatorial Africa. Right? Just the sentence doesn't fit, right? Just what the heck? And then the snows melt, and then they flood and create the Nile flood, the annual Nile floods, and that's what created this cycle in Egypt that made Egypt this incredibly fertile place. Per acre, Egypt is probably the most fertile place on earth when you're in the Nile Valley. And what that did was, that made it so Egypt could produce crazy amounts of food with almost no effort, without worrying about burning out their soil. The problem is weather, and sometimes weather cooperates, and sometimes weather goes haywire, and they were susceptible to droughts, and as a result, there was the possibility of famine. But also the other was true. They could get a flood that lasted too long, and it caused the crops to rot in the field, and so they had to constantly worry about the weather. Here's the thing: if they could pool their resources together, they could build granaries. And then in the granaries, they could store the grain. So what probably created the first government in Egypt was they probably went through this terrible famine event. A significant portion of the population died. And then the next harvest, they're bringing in the grain, and they're like, wow, we're leaving a lot of this grain here in the field to rot because we can just